Okay.
The lights are.
Hello? Yeah, okay. Okay, so we'd like to get started. We've got a very interesting evening planned with a discussion of climate change from several different perspectives. The whole idea of this term of the open classroom has been to look at the campaign from a political perspective, a policy perspective, and a media perspective. And we're very lucky to have three guests tonight, each of whom are going to share not just their views, but also talk about their experiences in trying to both address climate change, but also to get the story out there. I'm going to introduce them briefly, and then I'll explain the format. The guests this evening are Gina McCarthy, who is the former head of the EPA under President Obama. And under her leadership, the EPA passed a series of some of the most progressive actions to control climate change, to reduce pollution, to increase auto standards, just a really remarkable series of changes that were putting the country on a path towards lower and lower carbon emissions, cleaner water, cleaner air. As we'll talk about a little bit, a lot of that has been reversed by the Trump administration and setting up some real challenges for the next president, if the next president turns out to be a Democrat. Jenny Stevens is the head of the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs here at Northeastern. She's oversees the open classroom, which Ted and I are teaching this term. But her area of academic focus is the climate, especially issues of climate justice and equity, and how we can move forward on the climate in a way that benefits the economy and isn't seen as somehow punitive, which is the way many climate deniers or Republicans or conservatives sometimes frame it. And she'll be talking a bit about that. And then David Arnold is a former reporter at the Boston Globe, who's also a very talented and intrepid photojournalist. And David started out trying to look at issues of climate change. And I think, like many of us, facing this question of how do you get people to pay attention? How do you stop people's eyes from glazing over? You know, we hear about the polar bears, we hear about Micronesia sinking, we read about erosion on Cape Cod, and yet at a certain point, the question arises, I think, among readers or viewers, as well as among people in newsrooms, is this really getting through to people? So David found what I think is a very unique way to try to break through, and he's going to share with us a slideshow that he put together where he discovered a trove of photographs that were taken several decades ago of the glaciers. They were taken and housed in the Museum of Science here in Boston. And he went back and took pictures of how they look today. And then he did the same thing at the coral reefs, found pictures from decades ago, and then went back underwater to take pictures of them today. And I think it's been shown all around Boston, and I think has had a real impact on how people think about climate change, or at least to create a sense of urgency. So we're going to start with David's slideshow. Then I'm going to interview Gina McCarthy up here. Then Jenny is going to talk a little bit about climate justice and hope for the future. And then we're all going to play musical chairs and come up here and have a roundtable discussion with questions from the audience. So why don't we start out with David's piece first? Do you want to introduce it, or?
I just have to, can you hear me? All right, I just have to say that actually my partner in this crime is down here. Test. Hey, actually, I did this project with a woman named Gabriella Romanow, who happens to be in the audience, and there she is. I thought the hand would go down quickly, and it did. I just want to mention that it was a challenge. It's a challenge to try to take a photograph precisely as it was taken 10 years ago, 20 years ago, or in some of these cases with the glaciers 40, 60 years ago. Is really hey, there we go. It's particularly a challenge with coral reefs, and you should know that when you're looking at when people took editorial photographs of coral reefs 10 years ago, 20 years ago, they never thought of coming back. And so what Gabriella and I did was go up to a little place in Maine where this guy had collected photographs and magazines from a long time ago, and chose pictures that might be possible to go back to. And the challenges are many, and I won't bend your ear. I'm going to show you the pictures. But I had to show that I was at the same spot. And so the challenges just begin to mount up as you try to get a form in there in the picture that will convince you that I was at the same spot. And lastly, I just want to say that, believe it or not, I end upbeat, and I believe it the way I end what you are going to see. Very short at the end. Okay, here we go.
Thank you, David. So we'll have a chance. There you go.
Hi, everybody. Hi, everybody. Hi, everybody. Why is this not? Oh, here we are.
There it is.
Hi, everybody.
So, Gina, you've devoted most of your life to environmental policy, both in Massachusetts, Connecticut, the Obama administration, and now at the Chan School for Public Health at Harvard down the road, looking at it a bit of a distance. Can you just historically take us, when you were at the EPA and just before you left, what progress do you think had been made, and kind of where were we? And then what's happened since, and what's been the fall off or the improvement kind of then and now over the past few years?
That's a joke, right? Huge improvement since then. Just during the Obama administration, President Obama in his first term really thought that it was going to be possible to do a piece of congressional action, a law on cap and trade to try to address climate change. The president was very focused on two things at that point in time, healthcare and climate. It fell short of 2 votes in the Senate side to get the law done. And so the second term really was a discussion with myself and others who really were not interested in relying on Congress. Sorry, Congress, if any of you are out there. But they're not the most reliable bunch these days. So we decided that there were lots of other things that we could do, and the president developed a climate action plan. And that action plan had pieces to it that identified really strong actions that we could take through regulatory action and other policy initiatives domestically. Then it talked about what we would do with resilience. And then it talked about how we could use both of those efforts to really launch international efforts. So I was the person who was really the coach of all that. I sort of ran the team on how to get those issues done, and as a result, we completed 2 rounds of efforts to regulate the car sector that had, I think, really strong targets to achieve to make more efficient vehicles, and we did something called the Clean Power Plan, which was looking at regulating carbon emissions from the power sector. We did work on methane. We got an international agreement on Paris, which I will guarantee you, from having intimate knowledge of these issues, was all a result of President Obama and his work that he did with China and India going in. And we did the Kigali Amendment, which I will tell you was mine. I got the Montreal Protocol done to actually regulate refrigerant chemicals that were highly global warming as part of the Montreal Protocol. The international treaty that was looking at closing the ozone hole in the ozone layer. We used that as the mechanism. But soon, we knew that these were all measures that would have some success no matter what happened after. And I think that remains very true. And so you had the next administration come in. I don't think anyone ever expected that they would actually want to undo everything.
That was my question. Did you, people lose elections.
Did I not answer your question? Sorry.
No, but
it took an awful long time not answering the question.
Did you ever anticipate that there would be this kind of a massive rollback?
No, I don't think anyone could have. It's never happened before. You expect new policies to come in. You don't expect that the only policy is to undo everything that was done before. So it's highly unusual. And I will tell you that I have a little bit of a bone to pick about all the rollouts. Frankly, most of this administration is bluster. It's lots of announcements and crappy governing. So there's very little that has actually been officially rolled back. And a lot of what they've done has been officially rolled back of the rollbacks by the courts. So they have about an 8% success rate when they're challenged in court, which in my mind means it's 92% successful. And that's better than I ever did in college, so I'll take those marks any day. So I'm happy with that.
So if the Democrats win back the White House, how much time or ground do you think, we've lost?
Yeah. Well, there's more than what we'd lose in rollbacks. Let me give you an example. The clean car rules, there's all discussion about that, but frankly, the car industry knows the direction the world is heading, and it's heading towards getting rid of internal combustion engines. The biggest buyer of vehicles right now, like the biggest for GM is China. There's no question what direction it's heading. They don't want the change that this administration is proposing. It's just that this president is pretty unhappy when people complain, so you only see 3 or 4 of them willing to put their heads up, but they are. And on the Clean Power Plan, which was actually rolled back, but that's going to be in court soon, is that the clean energy is taking off because the success story is that you actually built it into the market. Renewable energy is winning. When you can make a strong economic argument, the rest sort of pales in significance. So that's continuing to move. And so there's a lot of successes that are going to continue, but there is no question that the agencies are in terrible pain right now. You have science has been questioned for everybody, so scientists, a lot of the key have left or they've been moved. They've been put in areas where they have no expertise to be able to do their jobs. You'll have a lot of rebuilding of the agencies to do. One of the biggest challenges I think we face is the lack of investment in innovation. The fact that they have been successful in stagnating the ability of the United States to innovate, because I still remain enormously hopeful in watching the uptake of solutions that are already available to us, but we have handed the future to other countries, and we'll have to spend a huge amount of time convincing people that we can win this battle, that we're not going to keep arguing about it, but we're going to start investing. President Obama used to go around and say that the country that wins a clean energy race is going to be the strongest in the world. And I think he's right. In fact, I pretty much know he's right. Right now, that's not us.
Who is it?
China. China is by far the winner in the energy market right now. They're selling a lot of the renewable energy systems that are being put in place in the U.S. now. But they have their own challenges. It doesn't mean that we can't recoup, but it does mean we're going to need a kick in the pants and an attitude change. And so if anybody thinks that I'm being anything other than angry, i.e. I am angry, so get over that. I get over it after about 5 minutes after I finish talking. But the issue is you have to be hopeful and you have to be demanding. And so this change can happen, and I am far from being hopeless.
So from a political point of view.
Well, I could be hopeless as a human being, but not real well when it comes to climate change.
But, I mean, you were doing politics as well as policy in Washington. And also,
I was.
So what's your analysis now of how the Democrats are approaching this? And do you sometimes wish you could, or maybe you already have, grabbed some of the candidates and said, look, this is the case you have to make. This is the way to win on this issue?
Some of them have grabbed me, not physically, but have called me, and I've read, I've helped critique some of the plans, and some of them didn't get the language quite right or the sequence of what they were proposing, and so I gave little bits of advice, certainly not wholesale, to quite a few of them. But I think they all get that this is an issue, but I think, with the exception of a few, and I won't name who, they see that as a separate issue from everything else. Do you know what I mean? I see it as a fundamental issue to everything else.
Talk about that some more.
Well, here's one of my pet peeves. Is they all talk about how many trillions of dollars they're going to spend on climate change. I think that's ridiculous. Because I think every single penny you spend at the federal level, you're doing something relative to climate change. And instead of talking about this ancillary set-aside that's never going to happen, You have to look fundamentally at why do we have a farm bill where we pay billions of dollars every year just to get bigger and better industrial farming when that's never going to feed everybody and keep water clean. You know what I mean? Why are we not looking at the transportation system and figuring out, instead of the system that's in place now that really rewards building new bridges and building new roads, and start shifting all of that funding to a climate future? You know, so I just think everything you spend in the military on down should be looked at through a climate lens. And most importantly, I think that they have trouble capturing climate change in a way that we try to do, Miranda and I and others, to personalize it. They still don't talk like it's as meaningful an issue as it actually is. Well, you know, what I mean by personalizing it, and I don't mean to denigrate the photos we just saw, but most people don't really understand what coral reefs do. Then, you know, they don't get a chance to see them in real life. They don't understand what they mean to fisheries and all that kind of stuff. But they sure as hell get when their kids have an asthma attack and air pollution's getting worse. And so I think we need to fundamentally shift to climate change to make it something that's relevant to human beings, so that you can get the breadth of people you need demanding change that will get the urgency in place to actually do what we need to do in the time frame that science suggests. We will not get that by a few people who get it because they've read climate science. It just doesn't work that way.
Does the Green New Deal move more in that direction, or does that
I love the Green New Deal.
Really?
I think it's really cool. And everybody always yells at me. You know, a lot of people yell at me. But I keep telling them, well, point a sentence out that you don't agree with. You know, it's the combination of sentences that float their boat about how awful this is. How can we ever do it? But honestly, I've never seen a problem that the United States has ever tackled that's as big as this, and that is as demanding as this, that we didn't set our sights on getting it done instead of pittering around at the edges. We don't have time to do that. And so I think the Green New Deal was a great opportunity for us to say, you know, this is a fundamental problem that will require change all over the place. Can we think about it systemically? Can we think about not leaving people behind while we build a clean energy future? We haven't done that before in the United States. We've just left people behind because the people left behind couldn't say anything. Right now it's become partisan and everybody votes for everybody, right? And so I think that it's time for us to acknowledge that this is a systemic problem. It's an economic choice we need to make in every sector, and we have to engage everybody in thinking about this differently. And I think that's what the Green New Deal challenges us to do. It's a radical statement of the variety of things that will be that is impacted by climate, and the variety of things you need to think of if you're going to effectively address it.
Yeah, but one of the challenges, I guess, is there are these new polls out that show that the divisions over climate change between Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives, are approaching the kind of polarization we see around abortion, for example. Yeah. That it's becoming so deep set, so weaponized by maybe the left and the right, but certainly by the right.
That should not surprise anybody.
Yeah, but so the question is, how do you, in that climate, which didn't even exist, I think, as much when you were in office. No. How do you deal with that? We had somebody from Fox News here last week, and he was saying, look, our job is not to tell our viewers what they need, it's to give our viewers what they want. And so how do you break through that when you're trying to push these issues?
I guess it depends on what you think people want. You know, do they want a line of bullshit? Or do they want the truth? You can't handle the truth, right? You know, sorry, I shouldn't have said that because this is live streamed. Beat me out. You know, honestly, I agree with you. It's enormously challenging. It's challenging on both sides because I don't understand how, you know, climate science isn't a belief system. It's not, when someone says I believe in climate change, I'm like, okay, what does that mean? It's just a set of facts. It is facts as best we know it, right, that science can tell us. And the challenge we have is that it's been built into the party platform on both sides, which have you ever seen that before? It's like saying, I believe in heart attacks. Let's put that in as a platform for ourselves. It just doesn't make any sense to me. And so I think I want people to understand that this is drama in Washington, D.C., but that drama is not being played out in every community and every household in the United States of America. So my goal is to get people to stop only thinking about Washington, D.C., and to start thinking about how democracies work. That's not it. I don't really care whether the federal government right now wants to do things or not. I care about whether families want to do it, whether we can drive grassroots actions at the community level, whether those can drive state-level actions. And I think all of those things are happening now. They don't make front-page news at Fox or MSNBC or CNN. But that's where I'm trying to focus my attention, because I've been doing this work for a long time, and I worked at the federal government for 8 years, and the federal government doesn't start anything new. It is driven by below, and that's how life works for us.
So give us some examples of that, because I think one of the things that comes out all the time, especially from students, but I think from everyone is, well, what can I do? Is it about straws? Is it about lobbying your congressman? Is it about solar panels on your roof? What are these local initiatives that aren't being covered, and how do we surface them?
I think people ought to stop dissing this plastic straw thing. I like it. I know everybody goes, oh, what can not using plastic straws do? Well, they can get people activated and thinking about something. I am happy about that. It's not going to be everything, but it is just like anything else. You edge people in, you get them interested, and then you get them doing things.
More people are talking about plant-based meat because of Burger King. I mean, that's...
Yeah, which is basically a fake hamburger that has absolutely no nutritional value, and you shove it in between two horrible buns, throw stuff on it, and tell people they're doing something good. Sorry, but that's my opinion. So I'm not real thrilled about that as a solution, but it does make people say, ooh, maybe you don't need to eat red meat so much, okay? But it is really about things you can do in your home, and it's not simple to do it in your home, and frankly, you have to recognize that a lot of the solutions to climate are much more accessible to people who have money, and that most of the health damages are in communities that don't. And so you have to look at, there has to be structural change in government interventions without question, but you can do things in your home like simply energy efficiency. You can think about renewable energy. You can look at the car you drive. You can look at the food you eat. You can try to phase out of red meat, which I keep trying, but I'm Irish. It's very hard for me. You can look at your kids' schools. You can develop food waste programs, so to try to minimize that. You can look at bike lanes. You can look at trees. You can look at parks. You can look at reducing heat stress by adopting an elderly person in your neighborhood and watching them when the heat gets hot. Make sure they're drinking fluids. I mean, you can develop community action plans. That's where I started in this business, working on just communities getting together, doing energy efficiency in town halls and all those places that we have in Massachusetts. I mean, there is just a wealth of things that you can do. And what I encourage people to do most of all is simply sit at the dinner table and talk about it. Don't treat it like it is a swear word that you can't bring up in public. It's
or
not.
Thanksgiving with your crazy Uncle Joe.
Exactly. Mine's Fred, but you can have Joe. We should trade. Joe might be nicer than Fred. Yeah, I mean, everybody runs into this, and honestly, it has to become part of our existence, part of our life. It can't just be an academic exercise or a few people who have the courage to talk about it. We all have to start integrating these thoughts into how we live our everyday lives. And the frustrating thing for me is, as I talked about things you can do, I didn't mention anything that if given the opportunity, you wouldn't want to do. I didn't mention anything that would be outside your economic wherewithal to do if the government did what it always does and incent things that are better for us. So that's what my biggest frustration is that I know that electric vehicles are all poo-pooed. They are too expensive, yes. But can we develop a system that makes them not so expensive? Oh, yeah, we could. The more you sell, the cheaper they're going to get. You see nobody ever advertising electric vehicles. Ever. And so it just drives me crazy. And the reason why electric vehicles are really not advertised is because the auto dealerships don't like them. You know why? They make most of their money on repairs. Electric vehicles need no repairs. So what am I trying to force everybody to suffer through? Better cars, higher performance, no repairs. I'm sorry. You have to grow more trees and have more playgrounds for your kids to play. Oh, what am I asking? It's torturous, right? I'm asking you to actually put solar on your roof and not have an intimate long-term relationship with utility. How awful is that? That's why it's so frustrating to me. If we just get off of this partisanship, you'll see below that there are governors in the most interesting states now, like New Mexico, right? Nevada, Colorado. All of these governors are actually all bought in because they're flashing dollar signs in front of their faces because they know that renewable energy is where they should be going. They're not arguing it from a climate perspective. They may pretend they are because it makes them feel good, but they're just doing it for money, and I'm so happy about that.
So let's go one level above. I mean, we have a lot of students in the audience, Gen Z, and then also millennials. So I think everyone thought maybe climate change would be a mobilizing issue, not at the local level, but at the political level. Do you see that happening? We've seen the marches by high school students, but where does Gen Z and millennials fit into this?
They're everything, in my opinion. Sorry, I'm not playing tag you're it yet because I still have 20 more years to scream and yell and swear at people, and I expect to use every one of those. But they're the people that are educated enough and have seen enough of this. And if my experience is anything, they're the ones that are ready to activate. They are activating. I'm really excited about the generations now that are in college, but even more so the young parents or the young people that are afraid to be parents. I want them to be hopeful. I don't ever want to hear one more young person coming up to me and saying, I'm not going to have kids because I'm not sure about a future. That is, to me, the most heartbreaking thing. Because they've given up before we've even had a chance. And so I think they are going to be the ones that are demanding more and faster, and they have to. The only thing that they're really not as good at as I would like them to be is voting. And I think they don't realize, at least I realize, I've been doing government my whole life, right? So I have seen since the Reagan administration a huge effort to explain how government is the enemy. In those exact words, it's back again. It's never really left us. And a lot of money spent to say government is just not efficient, not effective, can't work. And I'm afraid that history has rubbed off on young people. And instead of voting and using the democratic process, they're going outside that, which is fine, but you got to do both.
Well, maybe if you can give a brief history lesson from your own experience. I mean, the 1960s, obviously the country was incredibly divided over civil rights, the Vietnam War, all sorts of issues.
We've got that civil rights thing all checked out.
That's all taken care of. Yeah. People forget it now, but, the fear of nuclear war in the early 80s, the nuclear freeze movement, when people were out marching in the face of something that seemed, could end the planet. So what is that lesson for young people and for students now? I mean, people always think, it's never been this bad, but has it?
It has been. Things were really scary. When I was a little kid, we used to hide under, we'd have sort of, during the Cold War, we'd have, a bomb's coming, and we'd have a bomb scare thing. and they'd put the sirens on, and in your school you'd go under your table. Like, that's going to help, right? Like, oh, good, we got that licked. It was really funny, and what's really funny is one of my first jobs is I was working as the local health agent, and they gave me this wonderful job of being the civil defense person in the town. And I read the plan, and it was literally to get under something and put aluminum foil and wrap your head in it. Seriously, and that was their plan when I got there. I'm like, this is great. But anyway, I digress. But really what we learned in those days was that, it certainly in the Vietnam era, is that you don't have to trust government, you have to be the government. You have to be the checks and balance, that it's not going to happen itself. You have to fight, you have to march, you have to be really annoying. The younger you are, the more annoying you need to be, and you need to demand the change that you have to see. It's the only way that it works, and really, free press was a big part of that, which is why you have to look at what's happening today and understand that we have got to hurry to make the change we want to have, because we've got to act on facts. And we've got to have an ability to mobilize. But we're going to have to do the streets again. There's no question. I don't think there's any question about it. And the Youth March was just an amazing thing. It's just that we have to do it all the time.
When you look back at especially the years of the EPA under Obama and his decision to go for regulation changes, executive actions, I mean, was there a missed opportunity politically? Did you and others underestimate the resistance? And do you wish, if you had to do it over again, you would have made different arguments, different approach, pushed Congress harder? Are there lessons to be learned from that?
There probably are lessons to be learned, and I think it was legitimate to go for trying to get it done through a cap and trade mechanism, but in my opinion, you could see that it wasn't going well, because what it ended up being is a laundry list of, it ended up being hundreds of pages long of exemptions to every rule. Do you know what I mean? Because it ended up being with every political person, you had to do something to get their vote. And it just didn't have the urgency that it needed. Even if it passed, it might actually have been to our detriment, because it would have taken away the ability to look at whether or not existing laws can be done. Because to me, when you work under regulations where you have a protection of a law, it's harder to change a law in the system we're in, and you have the courts to provide the right balance. And so I think we were right to go for regulation in the second case. Maybe in hindsight, I would have done it earlier, but I probably would have anyways, because it's my area that I know.
I mean, I was struck when you said that China is now the leader in clean energy. Could you talk a bit about sort of the global context here, Europe, China, the U.S., and kind of whether it's economic competition or political alliances, how that's playing out?
Well, this is one of the reasons why I focus on health, is not just because, I view all of my work as being public health work. I had to convince everybody at EPA that they really aren't an environmental agency. Really, the ultimate thing you're looking at is saving lives, giving people clean water. That's not, I'm in love with water. It's, I need water. You know what I mean? And so because I think environmental people are too easily dismissed as being ancillary to fundamental stuff we need, which is ridiculous. It is a fundamental need. And so when we were looking at these issues, I think the one thing that I learned, and it's a very quick lesson, I did some work in China. Beijing had terrible air quality. We had an embassy in Beijing where they had a staff of about 300 people, and they all had families that lived there. And they're looking at the monitoring system in Beijing and what it says the air quality is like, and the staff called EPA and said, this is ridiculous. I don't know whether my kids should go out and play. I don't know if they should go to school, but the air quality doesn't look like it's showing. There was an ex-EPA person in the embassy. So we put a monitor on the top of the embassy, an EPA monitor. We trained her how to do the work. We supported the system. And every day they would tweet and say, what is the air quality like to their employees? And lo and behold, it got beyond the employees. And it created this huge international crisis. And I just happened to be in China at the time, which was really fun.
Because
the Chinese were furious.
Because their citizens were able to find out what was going on.
Because people in Beijing are middle class. And guess what? Middle class has clout, even in China. And they started talking about it like a social issue. So they visited me and said, you have to take this monitor down. And I said, I really don't, because that's U.S. soil, and it's staying there. And we had this back and forth, but I went back 2 years later. They had a whole new monitoring system. They had a whole new...
The Chinese had their own.
Yeah, they built a whole system around it. It's all Texas Instruments and all these other U.S. companies. And they realized then, China realized then, that that if they were going to win economically and not have social unrest, that they had the only one way to do it, and that was to think about the environmental implications, to think about air quality, to think about health consequence, because it was the one thing that brought the citizens in Beijing standing up and noticing and squawking loud enough that it became a social issue. That's when I realized that if we started really focusing on those immediate things that matter most to people, that then maybe you could think about a sound economic development strategy that actually did both. Because there is literally nothing that you do that reduces carbon pollution that doesn't also reduce conventional pollutants and make your world healthier, and vice versa. There's nothing you would want to do to make your life healthier that wouldn't also result in a reduction in climate change impacts. And so that to me was the whole ball of wax.
So, but when you talk about vice versa, what is the other side of it? I mean, do you worry about climate refugees? Do you worry about political instability in India and Africa? You know, that would dwarf the current immigration crisis.
Yeah, certainly there's both domestic challenges, I think, because of the inherent inequalities in health impacts that are being exacerbated by climate. There are a lot of, we'll talk about that later. But it's the same with who gets hurt first when there is a climate crisis. But you're absolutely right. I was looking back, and even in the Reagan administration, the Joint Chiefs of Staff and others were raising the military problems associated with the instability that's associated with climate change. They saw that then. They realized that it was a problem, and even in this administration, the Joint Chiefs are writing the same things, that climate is the most important international instability point that we have to face. If you look back, you know, the Syrian crisis that started all this anxiety about immigration across the world was a result of 3 separate droughts that happened in a row. All of the people coming from Central America are not coming here just because they want to hang out in the United States. They're coming here because you can't put food on your table, which is why there is an absolute direct relationship between economy and climate that we can either ignore at our risk or embrace it as the solution. And I think, honestly, there are ways in which we can do both, which is to build an economy and actually reduce some of the inequities in the world if we're careful enough to look at the steps we take and want to do it in a way that's more thoughtful than one big idea at a time.
So will you be declaring for president in the next couple of weeks before the next debate?
Actually, I'm heading up to New Hampshire tomorrow. Yep.
Okay, why don't we switch gears now? I'd like to invite Professor Stevens up, and then we'll all gather back here to discuss it. Thank you very much, Gina.
Great. Well, thank you. That was, it's great to follow. And I would like to present kind of an optimistic and inspiring presentation with a few provocative ideas, following up very well from the prior two speakers. So I'm going to talk about climate and energy justice and thinking about this, that we're really at the edge of transformation. And we have this, we think of it in terms of energy systems, moving away from a fossil fuel-based systems to more renewable-based systems. And what I want to share is a kind of optimistic perspective of what that can entail. So this transformation is really more than just about technology, and it's a lot about social change as well. And so I want to also share that I'm, similarly to the other two speakers, optimistic in part because of the diversification of leadership and ideas about how to address climate change that we're now seeing with the Green New Deal, with Greta Thunberg, with the climate strike, and Ayanna Pressley and other new congressional leaders that are bringing new perspective that connects climate change with other issues in ways that are really, really important and powerful. So I really see this transformation that we think about in technological terms as an opportunity for social justice. It really is an opportunity to think about redistributing power, literally and figuratively. So it's a kind of a pun on words because we're talking about different kinds of power, political power, economic power, as well as the actual energy system. So it's an opportunity for jobs and economic and community empowerment. And we have to acknowledge that this is a disruption. A transformation of the kind that we're talking about is going to be disruptive. So we can only expect and anticipate the resistance that we are experiencing because the people who are profiting from the current system don't want this transformation to happen. Another really important point is this is a shift from fierce competition of a scarce resource, which is fossil fuels, to an abundant and plentiful renewable resources. Literally, once you've put up the technology to harness that source of energy, it is abundant and plentiful and will keep coming, and that's what renewable means. And we're also getting to the point where the costs of inaction are actually greater than the costs of the transformation. We need innovations in terms of financial and investment and how to get the investments there. But as was mentioned earlier, investing in renewable energy is a great investment, no matter how. The companies, the individuals, the households, the countries that have invested the most in renewable energy are doing better than the rest, and they're going to continue to be doing better in all kinds of ways. So as Gina already mentioned, the benefits of this transformation away from fossil fuels to renewables is so much more than climate change. We don't even have to talk about climate change to talk about all the societal benefits, including health benefits of this transformation. And I do want to put this in context with the concentration of wealth and power that has perpetuated over the past 40 years or so. And this is, so the top figure is United States. The bottom is Western Europe. So this is a U.S., it's not only the United States, but it is specific to the United States, this concentration of wealth and power. The red is the top 1%, the share of national income, and it's gone from just about 10% to now closer to 20% of the top 1% owning that much. So the idea that I want to put forward as a kind of to introduce is this idea of energy democracy and a just transition. And just transition is acknowledging that the renewable energy transformation is an opportunity to reverse the inequities and disparities and advance social justice. And energy democracy is a growing social movement that really connects a lot of other social movements and expands environmental and climate activism to connect with this idea of redistributing power through the renewable transformation. And there are three phases or three parts of energy democracy: resist, reclaim, and restructure. And I want to go through those quickly before we get to through the discussion. So energy democracy is really thinking about this vision of a locally appropriate mix of renewables. It's not like everything's going to be solar or everything's going to be wind. There's also hydro and tidal and wave energy and geothermal. And everywhere around the world actually has renewable resources. They are distributed. And so every community in every region of the world can harness renewable energy in a locally appropriate mix. And this growing social movement is really acknowledging how the future based on renewables can also, that transformation can also be collaborative and participatory and embracing diversity in the distribution of who makes energy decision making, and it aligns with so many other social movements, including Black Lives Matter and other human rights and other social movements. So it's about resisting corporate control of energy, reclaiming energy policy for the public good, not corporate interests, and restructuring benefits and ownership so that individuals, households, and communities have control. So quickly, resisting fossil fuel power. There's lots to think about with the current administration, which is really accelerating and trying to advance fossil fuel extraction. Yet we have examples of efforts to resist that, particularly with the Union of Concerned Scientists kind of calling out some of the big energy companies that have had a decades-long strategic misinformation campaign to confuse us all about climate change and the science. And then we have recently, the NAACP came out with this really accessible report from their environmental and climate justice program that explicitly calls out the fossil fuel industry, and it created this illustrated primer with cartoons about the top 10 manipulation tactics of the fossil fuel industry. So here they are, you can look at, and encourage you to look at that. But number one is invests in efforts that undermine democracy. So when we look at this resist, reclaim, restructure, if you think about reclaiming the energy system, that is talking about democratizing energy decision making for the public good, making individuals, households, and communities and organizations that want clean and renewable energy to be able to have that. And there's a growing social movement for this local community control of energy. And diversifying who's involved in climate and energy innovation. I've been working in the energy space for 20 years, and a lot of conferences I go to look like this, which is a manel, which means a panel of all men. And diversity, really, we know, research shows, diversity brings helps with innovation on all levels, and it strengthens organizations, communities, and sectors. So there really is something to be optimistic about, seeing the more diversified leadership that we're seeing on climate and energy. And finally, just want to mention the restructuring idea, which really is about this heterogeneous mix and thinking about energy as a public good and the possibilities for community ownership and community benefits. And I will just say, that we think about, this is actually a figure that we used in the book that we published in 2015 about smart grid revolution, with the R in parentheses, and thinking about different people are prioritizing different places on this spectrum, thinking about incremental change, which we're getting to a point where we're realizing it's insufficient. We really need to be talking about more transformative change. And with energy systems, we can also think about centralization or decentralization. And I guess I would put forward the idea with energy democracy is really thinking about both large scale and really diversity of scale, right? That it's not all about local and individual, and we're going to need some macro wind farms and solar farms as well, but really diversity of scale and centralization is important. So I just want to make a quick plug. If you're interested in more about the social components of thinking about sustainability and climate change and the social justice implications, we're hosting a conference here at Northeastern, a big international conference in June, on sustainable consumption and social justice in an urbanizing world. And I will also just make a plug for the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs. We have multiple master's degree programs, a PhD program, and undergrad majors and minors, and graduate certificates, and lots of possibilities for exploring all of these issues and other issues and connecting environment with all these other social issues. So I'll end by just saying I think we have an amazing opportunity right now to harness the urgency, the climate emergency, to advance social justice. You know, some of us wake up every day worried about climate change, but a lot of people wake up every day outraged about the injustices that they are experiencing in our society. So we have this opportunity to harness the climate emergency to advance social justice, and then harness the outrage about social injustices for a transformative response to climate change. So with that, I would like to thank you and look forward to the conversation. And I will just mention my forthcoming book, coming out in next year, called Diversifying Power to Save the World. And it really talks about a lot of innovative things that are happening when we open up and make these connections and open up the opportunities for different people to get involved with different ideas. Thank you.
Great, thank you, thank you. So can Gina, can you join us up here, David and Jenny? If you can sit up here, and Ted. Why don't you sit next to me, David?
I knew it. See, it doesn't work.
So I'm going to ask the panel a couple of questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience. I guess one thing I wanted to raise, which is, I think the discussion was terrific. I think the presentations were terrific. The one thing that I didn't hear is something that I think is you're beginning to hear more and more in the media and places like that, is the sense of urgency. In other words, that we're beyond the point of kind of incremental change, obviously. We don't have time for small things. This is the kind of the Bill McKibben New Yorker argument and others, that this really is a climate emergency. And I'm wondering, you know, from your perspectives in the media, in policy, in kind of policy and dealing with students, whether we're being urgent enough, or, you know, and is there a way in which these are arguments that were true 10 years ago, but now we have to make even more dramatic arguments? So, David, you want to start with that?
Sure. How many people have been arrested for social cause in the last 10 years? I'm just finishing up a book about women's suffrage, and the likes of Alice Paul were out in front of the White House every single day, getting arrested, and finally Woodrow Wilson saw the light. And I agree with Gina. I think we need to be on the streets, and it has to get. Sorry, I may have people knocking at my door tonight, but we have to get angry. And I do have hope in this new generation. I want it to get a lot angrier. Have I answered your question?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, and Gina, can you you've been quoted as saying, make your parents angry.
Well, I would prefer that because my children are too old to really bother me, so I'll let other people spend. You know, I think you have a really important point. I think the challenge that I always face with the urgency issue is that very few things that relate to climate are going to be fixed in a very short period of time. So one of the things we don't talk about enough is how much time we can buy if we start moving right away and ask people to move forward. You know, I have two things coming up about getting arrested. That's really interesting, and it's a drama for me because I never thought getting arrested was a very good idea, especially when you work for the government. It's not a good idea. All right, but there are two things that have happened recently. One is I've been invited to Oxford to do a debate on the value of civil disobedience as it relates to climate. And the problem I had is I couldn't take the side they wanted, which was it's bad to be civilly disobedient. And I'm like, damn, I've crossed something now that I'm out of government. I'm really thinking about this stuff. The other is that, has anybody been following Jane Fonda? And she's just amazing to me. The woman's like 81 years old or something, and she's out there getting arrested every Friday for the next 4 months while she could get out of doing Frankie and Grace and Frankie show. And so every Friday she's getting arrested. She's doing an event, getting arrested. And I happen to have a good friend of mine runs Greenpeace in the U.S., and she got arrested with her the first time. And she said they went to this holding. I'm sorry.
That was a great story.
It's a cute story, though. So they all get arrested. And the way it works in Washington is if you get arrested for this kind of just civil disobedience stuff, you pay $25 and you're out in not too long. So they basically told her, if you plan to get arrested every Friday for the next 4 months, we might have to keep you overnight. And then so the minute they hit the sort of cell, everybody gets up off the one bench that they have and says, sit down. She said, absolutely not. She went over to a wall and started doing wall sits, and does exercises the entire time she's there and talks about what they're going to do the next Friday. So I'm going to be joining her on her birthday, which is a weekend in December. And I'm going to do a whole bunch of stuff with her, and then I'm going to think about whether I get arrested or not. So I'll let you know. My husband's not pleased with this discussion, but it's okay.
Jenny?
Well, I guess I would just say, change can actually happen pretty quickly when it happens. And so I think we're building toward, if we learned anything these past few years, is that things happen that we wouldn't have imagined could have happened, and change happens. So I think, I feel, again, some optimism in terms of building toward, and you're right also that over the past few decades, we've been aware, we've had the opportunities, we've had the technologies, and we haven't been able to do it, right? And so that's where the incremental change is no longer what we need, and so the deeper transformative change is we're ready for it and need it, and so I think that's what we're building toward. Yeah.
So we've been talking about how the media helps to influence policy, particularly as that's going to affect the election next year. There have been some massive demonstrations here and abroad, and it's not yet clear that it's having much of an impact. So where are we falling short in that regard, particularly in terms of the media's role in speaking to the massiveness of people's concern about this stuff?
Gina, you want to?
Well, I think it's one thing to show a crowd of a couple of 100,000 people in Montreal, which was really impressive, but it's another thing to tell an individual story. And I think that where journalism helps the most is when they can tell that individual story. And I don't think we do it enough. And I think that's the most important thing, is to paint a picture. And I think there are a lot of pictures that you can paint about the people that have been left behind. And there's different language you can use that sort of compel people to take action. For some reason, big numbers mean nothing to people. In my world, we've done a lot of work on if you're going to improve health, what will people care about? People don't get impressed by numbers of people dying from a health problem. They get impressed by living sick. So if you talk about kids with asthma and challenges, you'll get a lot further. So you got to think about how people perceive stuff and how you're going to impress them and relate to them. And I think the challenge, a lot of this, is that unlike the nuclear issue where you were focused very heavily on government intervention at a high level, we're in many ways our own worst enemy on this. We have to change our own behaviors to make change happen. But that is an opportunity that has many dimensions to it. And we just have to get over it and figure out how to move.
And one of the points that I think all of you have suggested, but especially Gina and Jenny hit this point, that the impact of climate change is disparate, right? That it's the people, poorer people, people of color, countries that are still struggling that are being hit the most. And a lot of the energy, as we know, in the environmental movement has come from more well-to-do people and so forth. How do we narrow that gap? In other words, because I think there is a perception, this has been widely written about, very often the environmental movement is seen as white, it's seen as privilege, it's people in the Back Bay worried about rising seas, when right now there are situations in neighborhoods around Northeastern where there are, real pollution issues that are affecting kids' lives every day. How big an issue is that gap, and how do we narrow it?
Yeah, so a lot of the renewable incentives originally, or still, have been very much geared toward people who already have, $10,000 or $15,000 in the bank, can put on those solar panels on their home ownership, their own house that they own. And some of those incentives have actually, have led to increasing disparities, right? Because then those people get the benefit, and then they get the free electricity for the next 20 years, whereas other people who haven't had that investment then have, are actually paying more, definitely proportionally. So there's a big recognition recently about that, and there's strategies and initiatives and to try to get the renewable energy investments to low-income communities and connect that with job training and all of that. But another piece that you mentioned in terms of impacts is the disparities. And there's also research that shows that after a disruptive event, more vulnerable people and households and communities have a lot harder time even recovering and reestablishing even where they were before, let alone improving, whereas more well-off people are able to navigate the system and get reimbursed and get their insurance and sometimes end up better off after a disruption. So again, this is where the more the resilience of thinking about climate adaptation and how the impacts of climate change are disparate. And we need acknowledgement of that, and then systems and regulations and policies to try to counter that, and because that's not good for any of us.
Ted, do you want to weigh in on that just from a city point of view? You've been doing a lot of work looking at Boston as a city that's dealing with a lot of inequality and divided neighborhoods, and how climate can both either divide people or unite people.
Well, we did a conference last Friday on how to engage communities in addressing issues of resilience. And one of the takeaways for me, one of the things that struck me is that there are a lot of groups all over the city that are working on these issues. Many are at the community level. Many involve young people mobilizing at the community level. And then many are at a very high level in terms of their advocacy. And what startled me was that a lot of the people had never met each other. We had panels of half a dozen people on each panel. They're working in the same realm. They all have their 501c3. They're out there doing all kinds of things. And yet for many of them, the first time they had met each other was when they sat together on a panel. So it does strike me that part of the challenge is to get the groups to simply talk to each other and collaborate with each other, both across the city and across disciplines, and across class and race lines. And there doesn't seem to have been a lot of that going on thus far, even in a city this small.
Could I just make probably what is an obvious point, and that is that, one of the exciting things about youth engagement in climate change is their insistence on a just solution. They are extraordinarily focused on equity. And I look back and I realize that what I think is probably may not be true, but is my belief, is that the older you get, the more you get used to injustice. You just get numb to it. And so the younger the voices are, the more outraged they are by it. And they remind me that you just can't ignore this. You have to speak out. I remember when my kids were little and they'd say, oh, the teacher, I got a bad grade and it's not fair and blah, 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 blah. And I'd say, well, that's sort of the way it is. And I look back and go, why the hell would I say that? Do you know what I mean? You try to explain, oh, don't fight City Hall. And I'm like, why not? So I'm really excited about the focus of young people on equity issues. I think it matters. One of the very reasons I focus on health is essentially an issue of inequity. Pollution is not an equal opportunity killer. It goes after the most vulnerable, the people that don't have fresh food, that don't have good nutrition, that have diabetes. Who do you think is most impacted when air pollution gets worse? So there are ways in which today there are monitoring systems that are available and frankly in use a lot of places that give you air quality results down to the 1 kilometer and can get you down to a block. When we start showing where the damage is and how inequitable that is, maybe we'll be able to sit up and do something about it. So I'm really excited about the new opportunities we have to raise these issues and the focus that young people have, because I think they'll come up with a much better systemic answer than we may ever have because we didn't have the direct knowledge. We could hide from it. We didn't want to admit it, and eventually we got numb to it.
Great, so let's open it up.
I had the benefit of waving at her first. I have just a couple of comments and a question.
Raise your hand.
I'm over here. The first thing, and I talk about this in my classes, is I'm in the economics department. So I talk about Jimmy Carter's and the culture of malaise speech, specifically because that took us back to a time when we had an energy issue in this country. And he was actually looking at it from a conservation perspective. And today, we don't really talk about reduction in use. We talk about substitution in terms of how we're going to generate. With that, in conjunction with population growth, which is another big issue, I don't know how we're going to actually mitigate to the extent that we need to, let alone adapt. That's one question. The second thing, you brought up young people a lot, and I have a nonprofit, which Jenny knows about, on the Cape. We have a plastic bottle ban, so we're doing that across Cape Cod right now. And we've been very successful, and we'll have a commercial ban next year. But the point I'm really trying to make here is young people are as knowledgeable as their teachers. And I think that is one element that we really need to focus on. I know it's nice in terms of PR to talk about the youth, but it's also a celebration of our educational system when you see young people out there fighting for the future. And I think it's time that we start to put some value on the educational system and on our teachers for that. And that being said, when we think about young people, it's not necessarily that it's a pervasive element. And this is an area, especially given this discussion, where I think we need to bring it to light, that it's important for an institution that claims that sustainability is a part of it, that they integrate it within every aspect of what we do. I am in the economics department. I am definitely an outlier when it comes to talking about sustainability. It is part of everything I talk about. I feel it so it's a moral responsibility. And then those are the only two things I wanted to say, but thank you.
One thing I will point out, it's a small thing, but it's interesting. We normally have plastic bottles of water up here for the speakers. And Jean, I think, was the one who basically said, I am not going to give Gina McCarthy a plastic bottle of water. But I think it's to your point that it's kind of a deliberate thing that people have to think about in a lot of different ways. But other people.
Well, I was just going to respond. You mentioned Carter, and not everyone in the room may know that there were solar panels on the White House that Carter put up. And he wore a sweater in his address, and that's where there's actually an aversion to this notion of sacrifice and conservation, and we'll be okay. We'll just have to, So I think that's part of the political history of why it's hard to talk about that. But as Gina was saying, the things that we're actually talking about what really matters in terms of well-being isn't the high consumption issues, right? So there is a lot of potential there for reduction in consumption. And I will also just mention I'm very involved in trying to work with Northeastern as a university and our own sustainability initiatives here on campus and connect our academics and our research with our campus and our community and our engagement and connecting all the dots there. So there's a lot of opportunities that we're working on and look forward to working with you more on that.
David, let me ask you, I mean, the slideshow you showed at the start it was a display at the Museum of Science. It was shown at a concert down by the river. It's been a very public thing. What's been the reaction to it, and where do you think it fits into this question of, local response versus global response, how you cut through people's resistance to what's going on?
I think the most effective way that presentation works is, and it happened in Akron, at a symphony in Akron, Ohio, and Ohio is a kind of a tough place to go if you're talking about climate change. But the most effective way is when the person who is on the fence or a denier sees the person next to them in tears, and nothing gets said, but it's, I have just started putting this to music, to Samuel Barber's Adagio for strings, to sort of double the impact. And all I can say is that I hope to find more symphonies. I'm working on that, to find more symphony orchestras that will play it. I'm going to say something that's going to be sure not to get me invited back. Jenny, I don't think you'll want to invite me back. I don't think this can be done without nuclear energy. And when I compare when you look at France and how effective they've been with 20 nuclear reactors they export electricity. I just don't think the budget is going to work. I'm going to watch Jenny pick up the microphone. I think I've heard James Hansen argue about this and say it. I mean, there's for me, the grandfather of this whole issue. I'm certainly not going to work it into my presentation, my slideshow, but I just think that's a reality that we don't face. And lastly, this is John. I'm not answering. I'm straying here. I think there's a seismic change taking place. I think that 2 or 3 more hurricanes, and I think it's going to be a vastly different landscape on this whole subject. I'm sorry we have to wait that for long. I'm sorry that we can't take the initiative and be smart enough. But I think fear and hope will be drivers.
Hi.
While we're getting the mic out,
right here.
Oh, you ready to go?
Yes.
Okay, go.
Unless you want to say something, but. Well, first of all, thank you so much for this panel. It's really refreshing to hear older people talking about climate justice, environmental justice, all those things that we've been talking about for so long. No offense. So I want to know more about how youth can be involved, because you're talking a lot about how we've raised our voices, come out to the streets, really talked about environmental justice and brought it to light. I want to know how we can take that next step towards action as people in high school and college and young professionals who really don't have the money and power that a lot of older people have to make that systemic change.
Green New Deal, Sunrise Movement, get involved politically and demand the change and the investments that we need in communities and people.
Yeah, VOTE, please.
Who has the courage? And I'm sorry, just one last thing. I have not yet sucked up the courage here, but I live on the Boston waterfront, and I watch these yachts pull in that are the size of most of the building here. Only once have I gone down to actually try to ask a question diplomatically. Wow, what do you think your carbon footprint is? And they usually answer, oh, we burn diesel, which is no answer at all. But how many? And then there's these speedboats that take tourists out. I mean, if you want to be a jerk, you can go down with a sign on your back. I mean, how far do you want to go? But if and I've thought about this. My wife is in the audience. I don't think I've shared this with her, but I'd be willing to go down with a placard. Okay.
Just in further response to the last question, we do have some faculty here who have sons and daughters who've been involved here on campus and in their high schools with the movement in very direct ways. Rebecca, you want to say anything with the Social Action Lab?
Thank you. I don't mean to interrupt, but I'm happy to respond to that question. Boston is the hub of the Sunrise Movement. It has an extraordinary cluster of young people at high school level who are working with the Global Strike movement. They're the ones who mobilized. That was a completely youth-led movement. If you are an adult, if you are a middle-aged white person, one of the best things you can be doing right now is marshaling for these events and keeping young people and marginalized people safe. So young adults, I encourage you to look for ways to work with the youth. They have the most extraordinary understanding of social justice and power sharing. Young white men are learning that their job is to uplift the voices of their sisters of color, and they're learning to live by that. And so if you are college level, I suggest Sunrise Movement. They will teach you so many of these ways of being involved. It is about social movement building and action taking. And if you are interested in joining, if you know people in high school, I will be here afterwards, and I will happily connect you with those. They are planning a series of actions in Boston between Thanksgiving and the holiday season. And so there's plenty to do, and they're looking for recruits.
Hi, good evening. First of all, I have to say thank you, Gina, for the graduation speaker at the Yale last year. When I was cheering and clapping, and lovely to meet you here again. That's good. It's good to listen to those who preach what they practice. In this battle against the global warming and environmental catastrophe, now it looks like it's much more momentum in the West. I'm talking United States, England. How does this affect developing countries? That they should be factored into this equation. Otherwise, it will be, work done against friction is what it will end up to be.
So the question is about third world countries, kind of where's their role in this?
Well, it's really all about the global south, which is where I think a lot of the interest in investment is going at this point. Part of the challenge that we have to admit is that the developed world has sucked up the capacity of the earth to take more carbon emissions. And now you have the developing world that has a right to develop and to continue to grow. And the challenge is going to be, how do we learn together? And how do we support that effort? There is, part of the drama for me about watching the White House Rose Garden event that decided not to maintain the Paris Agreement. One of the arguments to get out of the Paris Agreement was that we would pledge $3 billion, have to pledge $3 billion. That's outrageous. Well, you had 2 Navy bases that were destroyed and that were damaged in a hurricane, still function but damaged. They cost $14 billion to fix. Okay? So it's frustrating to me because we know the need to make investments in the developing world, hopefully to leapfrog and continue to invest in your own economies and build the world up, which will make us all stronger. But it's enormously important for us to be part of the game to be able to make those investments happen. And so part of what the excitement when I was in Paris and helping with some of those negotiations was we created not just a green fund and thought about that, but we also had a capacity building fund, which is essential. You need to share information and understanding and expertise, build the capacity of the developing world to help themselves. This is essential. And we have yet to fulfill that promise of the United States, and obviously we're backing up on that promise. And to me, it's not just embarrassing, it's heartbreaking, because you now have people in India, it's either 200 or 300 million human beings that don't know if they're going to have a drink of water the next day. And you have people living in air quality that honestly, I don't know how anyone does it. They don't do it for long. And it's just heartbreaking that we have sort of abandoned our international responsibilities, and certainly our responsibility as one of the largest emitters. But I know that this is where the majority of the international focus is happening right now, even if the United States isn't in a leadership position on it.
Okay, we can take one more question. Yeah.
This isn't a question, it's a comment.
Well, we prefer a question.
Well, it's an important comment. I'm a micro-entrepreneur, and I'm thinking of all the easy solutions there are to many complicated problems that someone thinks of over the years. And when I came down here tonight, I took an Uber, and the guy who drove the Uber was fairly intelligent, except when I asked him, and he's also a Trump supporter, I asked him what he thought of the Kurds. He didn't know who the Kurds were. Okay, now, I just went into the food business for poor people. And it just occurred to me as I was sitting here, I was so upset about the conversation I had before here, that the possibility of reaching people and letting them know how dangerous and how unhealthy it is for the problems that you talked about tonight, that if we organize, if you eminent people or people that you thought this was a half-decent idea could organize food manufacturers to put on the boxes of all the foods that they sell, like Heinz or major manufacturers who no one reads what's on those boxes anyway. They only read the name. And what's happening is the older 48% of what Mrs. Clinton called deplorables are not so deplorables. They don't know they don't have information. Where do they get their information? They don't watch television. They don't read the papers. They don't listen.
Okay, yeah, I take your point. Let me ask the panelists.
The food industry is a key to communicating with people.
Let me ask the panelists to kind of end on this note, because we have here, an Obama appointee, 3 college professors, a guy who used to work for the Boston Globe. It's a bit of a bubble. But what would you suggest to reach the kind of voters that we're talking about should be a message around climate change that would be aimed at the red states? If not the Trump base, those people who maybe voted for Obama but then voted for Trump, moving people as opposed to just living within the bubble that we have. Jenny, you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I guess I would say I think we want to be careful about the notion that if we're just giving people more information, they'll think differently. That's actually not. We know from research that isn't necessarily the case. So I think we need to be thinking about, and this is what some of the things we were talking about, are trying to, engage with people on where they are and what they're worried about, right? And for many people, it's health, it's jobs, it's education. And that's what we're trying to, make the connections. And it's not hammering home carbon reduction, because that isn't what people wake up every day worried about, right? And so that's where some of the again, with the Green New Deal as a framework within which to think about in a policy realm how to connect some of these issues that have been siloed and separated, putting things together and thinking about people's well-being is a strategy there.
Gina, final word.
Just that, I think you need to find out what people care about and talk about that issue. So I still like information is power. I think it matters. I don't think anybody doesn't have an ability to learn if you can provide them information. But honestly, we always start from our own point of view and then look at the blank stares and wonder why nobody's thinking the same. if you go into a community that is very high poverty and very, then they're going to worry about putting food on the table, and they're going to think I'm nuts when I go and talk to them about climate change. But climate change is about putting food on the table. And so I think you can start where people are, not tell them what to do about it, but acknowledge the problem and ask them to help you think about the solution. And so I think many times we just think we have a solution, or we think we know how to frame a problem, and it's going back to square one, which is meet people where they are, talk to them with as much sincerity as you can, and listen. Let them develop the strategies that will make their life better, and I will guarantee you it will make yours better.
Well, that's a terrific note to end on. I want to thank the panel for coming here, the audience for being so engaged. We'll be back next week with a discussion of gun control, criminal justice, and crime. So, yeah, easy compared to this. Thanks very much. We'll see you next week. Thank you. That was great. Thank